welcome everyone. Thank you for attending this afternoon's Martin Center book discussion webinar. Our guest today is Mary Grabar, who will be talking about her recent book, Debunking the 1619 Project, Exposing the Plan to Divide America. Now, the book discussion series is a fairly new venture for the Martin Center, and the first one that I've hosted. My name is George Leaf. I'm the Director of Research here. And for those of you who are not familiar with the Martin Center, it's a nonprofit organization dedicated to higher education reform. We advocate responsible governance, viewpoint diversity, higher academic standards, greater affordability, and market-based expansion of college choice. Before starting today's discussion, I'll let you know that our next one will be in May, but we don't have it scheduled yet, so please check our website. Now, here's how our event is going to run. I will introduce Mary, who will then talk about her book for roughly 20 minutes. After that, I will kick off the discussion with a few questions. Then about 3 p.m., I'll turn to questions that viewers have submitted. And you can send in your questions at any time using the Q&A icon. And if you're using Facebook, you can post your questions in the comments section. We'll be recording this event if you want to watch it later or share it online. Now, as for our speaker today, Mary Grabar was born in Slovenia, then a part of communist-run Yugoslavia, but her parents escaped the United States when she was 2. She earned her English, a PhD in English from the University of Georgia in 2002, and has taught at several colleges in Georgia, including Emory University. Since 2014, Mary has been a resident fellow at the Alexander Hamilton Institute for the Study of Western Civilization in Clinton, New York. She writes a very provocative and lively blog entitled Dissident Prof, which I highly recommend to you. Now, Mary has really found her calling in the last few years. That calling is debunking left-wing disinformation. Her 2019 book, Debunking Howard Zinn, exposed the falsehood and deceptions in his infamous American history text. And then last September, her book, Debunking the 1619 Project, was published. So without further ado, let's turn things over to Mary Grabar.
Well, thank you for having me. It's great to see you again. Yes, I seem to have gotten on this debunking kick here, and there was a lot to debunk in the 1619 project, and I hope I covered the main points in my book, which came out in September, as you said. So this book came out, or the 1619 project came out actually around this, I think it was a day after or before my book on Howard Zinn came out. And when I saw it, I thought, you know, I just had to write about it. I didn't think things could be worse than what Howard Zinn wrote, but I'm continually surprised. So for those people who don't really know what the 1619 project is, I just want to review briefly. So on August 18th, 2019, the New York Times came out with a special issue of its magazine, and it was called the 1619 Project. There was also a 15-page insert in the newspaper, which had photographs of artifacts and short articles. But the main project was the special issue of the magazine that had this kind of somber photograph of Port Comfort, which is where the first Africans arrived in America sometime in August of 1619. So this was a commemoration of the 400th anniversary of that event, which happened the month after the establishment of the House of Burgesses, which in my opinion is a more important event because it was the first representative form of government here. However, This was the brainchild of Nicole Hannah Jones, who is a reporter for the New York Times. Her beat has been education and racial issues. She is not a historian. She pretends she knows about, quote, historiography, unquote, but really is someone who was influenced in a high school Black Studies class when she was given a book by her teacher, Mr. Dial, by Lerone Bennett. And it was called Before the Mayflower, and it was about this event in 1619. The magazine consisted of about 10 essays and 17 literary works. So this was supposed to be a historical commemoration, and oddly, there were more literary works than essays dealing with historical topics. There was a photo montage, there were short profiles of the contributors, there were photographs of Howard University law students who had descended from slaves and so forth. And they knew that this was not an accurate history, so they called it a reframing of our country's founding. It was an interpretation. Sometimes it's called truthful history, other moments, Nicole Hannah Jones, who has become the celebrity spokesman for it, calls it a narrative. She calls it an origin story, but the intent is really to replace 1776 with 1619 by positioning this event, which happened by happenstance, as the defining moment of our country's founding. So how did these Africans get here? Well, they weren't immediately enslaved. They had been captured by a privateering ship. They were on a Portuguese slave ship going to Veracruz, Mexico. And then they were captured and they were brought to Jamestown sometime, as Captain Smith said, in the latter part of August of 1619. We don't know exactly how many people were there, between 20 and 30. They were exchanged for food and provisions. We don't know if they were indentures like the English who were living there and working and suffering in the tobacco fields. So it's a nebulous event. Much is not known about it. There was no form of government established, when this happened to happen. But nonetheless, it is positioned as this defining moment of our country's history. And the reason it is because the thesis that's motivating the whole 1619 project is that this nation was not founded as a democracy, but as a slaveocracy. And that's the word that is used. We were a slaveocracy. There was no freedom, no democratic form of government. In reality, because a significant portion of the population was enslaved. So the Black Freedom Movement was, we really did not even start to have an inkling of a democracy until 1965. That's the thesis of the 1619 project. And secondly, the wealth of this country was built on the backs of slaves. So slaves are responsible for this, and their descendants are responsible for this nation becoming the richest and most powerful nation in the world. This probably will strike most people as being a bit of an exaggeration. I think we can say that certainly The enslaved and their descendants and free Black people have contributed immensely to this country, culturally, in terms of economics, in inventions, and so forth. But the claim that they alone made this country what it is a gross exaggeration. The end game of this is reparations, and that became apparent when Nicole Hannah-Jones published an essay called What is Owed in the June 2020 New York Times magazine. And then after that was published this November, the 1619 project was expanded to this monstrosity, which is almost 600 pages long, and a children's picture book, which repeats the gross errors of the 1619 project. So I want to position this. So there were other publications that had commemorated the 400th anniversary. Actually, President Trump did too, in a speech for which he was taken to the woodshed by Nell Painter. He commemorated the formation of the House of Burgesses, and then also mentioned the people who were enslaved and who had suffered, and gave homage to them, although that wasn't the whole thrust of his speech. There were other magazines and newspapers that commemorated the year 1619 in August of 2019. Time magazine did a special, USA Today did a big spread, but those got very little notice, and there were other newspapers and journals as well, but those got very little notice. And the reason is that they were not inserted into the schools immediately at the beginning of the school year of 2019, as the 1619 project was. So this was all very well planned. So the New York Times, which of course is a for-profit company, which makes a considerable amount of money from its education division, partnered with a nonprofit called the Pulitzer Center, which is not affiliated with the Pulitzer Prize at all. But the Pulitzer Center is funded by the same people who have been funding these initiatives that have swayed our elections, namely Mark Zuckerberg of Facebook and Pierre Omidyar, the billionaire who started eBay. So this was all pre-planned, and these lessons with copies of the 1619 project were inserted into 3,500 schools immediately across the country. They were accepted as supplementary materials, so they didn't go through the normal vetting process. And I think that is most of the reason for the justified outrage against it. This project is factually wrong in so many ways, it's almost hard to know where to begin. That was part of the challenge of writing the book. And I think most people would not have cared if the New York Times had published this commemorative issue. We know the political views of the New York Times for most of what it puts out. We wouldn't have cared if, people were lining up at newsstands to buy it, if they wanted to, read it, reread it, discuss it, have discussion groups, frame it, line the hamster cage with it, whatever you want to do with it. That's my opinion too. You can, publish what you want. I'm a proponent of the First Amendment, but it was immediately put into schools, and the public had no overview of it, and no school boards, no academics really. Most of the contributors are journalists or creative writers. So this was grossly incorrect in terms of facts. And so I try to go into the stories, the background, the context, which is what is missing from the 1619 project. But some of the big factual errors, I'll just name some. I've got about a dozen here. First of all, the first one that was immediately noticed by noted historians like Sean Wilentz and Gordon Wood was that the Revolutionary War was fought largely to protect slavery. That the revolutionists were afraid that Britain was going to outlaw slavery, so that was the motivation. Another claim was that slavery here was unlike anything that had existed in the world before. And I use that phrase as the title of one of my chapters because it implies that slavery was basically invented in 1619 with the arrival of these Africans. And these Africans were not immediately enslaved, and our, institution of, or the legalization of slavery evolved over that century. But the claim that it was unlike anything that had existed in the world before is just such a huge error. I mean, slavery has existed every place in the world. It has been advanced and justified by the major religions. It has existed as far back in history as we can go. In 1776, slavery was in existence on every continent in the world except for Western Europe, though it was in the colonies and in Antarctica. So it was a common institution, and it, the practice was as cruel as it was on any plantation. And so I go into that, the practices across the globe, in Africa particularly, where it had existed for centuries before the slaves were, captured and sold to the Europeans. A common practice was to use slaves as human sacrifice. So I go into that, which brings me to the third point. The claim is made that the slaves were kidnapped from Africa by Europeans who went into the interior, and that is completely false. I go into that a bit. The Portuguese had tried that. It didn't work. They were wiped out. The few times the Europeans did go in and capture slaves was with the assistance of the African warring tribes. This is a point that's made in this picture book for kids beginning in kindergarten, and it's presented in very emotional terms that mommies and daddies were captured by the white people in Africa, which is absolutely false. And the writer, Nicole Hannah Jones, knows that. I've discovered that. So she is deliberately lying. The claim is made that these people were leading peaceful lives in Africa. No, that's not true. They were enslaved. They were captured by chiefs. I'm looking at the time. How much time do I have? Because there's a lot of errors here.
Oh, about another 10 minutes, perhaps.
Okay, good. All right, let's see. The country began in 1619 as a slaveocracy. No, there were no legal rules for slavery. It evolved. Nell Painter, who was a big critic of President Trump, said that. She wrote a column in The Guardian and outlined that. But of course, she did not correct Nicole Hannah Jones. She corrected the President of the United States. The other big error or the point of attack is on Jefferson. Two major figures are attacked, Jefferson and Abraham Lincoln. So these are two pivotal figures in American history. So the Apostle of Liberty, as Jefferson has been known, is made out to be a kind of a Simon Legree figure from Uncle Tom's Cabin, that he relished enslaving people and torturing them and working them to death, that he never wanted to abolish slavery. And that is absolutely wrong. I think I probably devote most time in my book to Jefferson. He, worried about slavery. He tried to think of ways to end it peacefully. He could see that a civil war was coming, and he, in terms of being a slave owner, he was born into it. He inherited slaves, but in relative terms, he was, not the worst of them. He was concerned about keeping families together, keeping people fed and clothed and taken care of. He did not like the institution of slavery, and he saw to it as president that the international slave trade was ended. He called it an abomination, and he thought it was a necessary first step to ending slavery altogether. Another point is that slaves were considered to be subhuman. Not exactly. They weren't free, but they were recognized as human beings, and the laws regulating slavery in America were not that much different from the rest of the Western world, or the rest of the world. Only white people owned slaves. I go into some of the statistics and the studies that have been done that started with Carter Woodson and that have been refined. And when we look at the proportions, a third as many free Blacks proportionately as whites owned slaves for exploitative purposes. So it was not an exclusively white practice, which is the message that the 1619 Project wants to send out. There's a gross exaggeration of the economic contribution of slavery and the cotton industry. There's a claim that's made from the new historians of capitalism that cotton produced by slaves made up 50% of the GDP. There's a slight mathematical error. It was only 5%. The other claim is that Blacks on their own led the way to freedom and democracy. So there are no white abolitionists, no white civil rights workers. Abraham Lincoln is depicted as, not caring about slaves at all, which was completely false. Another thing, all white people benefited from slavery. That's not true. As we know, economically, slavery kept the South backwards economically. There wasn't the infrastructure built, there wasn't the industry, wages were kept down for white people. So who really benefited from slavery was, the quote unquote 1%, as it was termed during the Occupy Wall Street movement. So a few people got very, very wealthy, including some Black slave owners, but it did not enrich everyone. Colonization was an idea of Lincoln's because he just wanted to get rid of Blacks and ship them off to some hot place, preferably Africa, and that grossly oversimplifies it. And finally, I think another factor is that that the way it's written, it is intended to stir up feelings of hostility towards white people, because white people are presented with this broad stroke. And, looking at the language of it, you see that this is not written in a historical manner, in an even-handed way, with giving context and perspective. One of the passages that has been pointed out is a sentence like this one. In response to Black demands for their rights, white Americans strung them from trees, beat them and dumped their bodies in muddy rivers, assassinated them in their front yards, firebombed them on buses, mauled them with dogs, peeled back their skin with fire hoses, and murdered their children with explosives set off inside a church. That is from Nicole Hannah-Jones's lead essay in the magazine, which is the most important essay because the others sort of revolve around it like a constellation and support it. Now, this is something that is taught to students, high school students. It's repeated in her essay in the hardcover book. So when critics say that this is inappropriate material for the classroom, they are correct, because these are stereotypes. This is incendiary. It's intended to pit one race against another, because per critical race theory, one race is a victim and the other race is an oppressor, and no distinctions are made at all. Anyway, I think at this point, over half of the states have either introduced or passed legislation forbidding the use of this material in the classroom. Another strategy has been these laws that would allow parents to view all the materials. So I think this is a good strategy. This is material that was never vetted, never would have been entertained, in years gone by for the classroom. And so I wrote my book in order to present a different perspective, hopefully an interesting perspective, and a tool and a resource for people to have as they fight what I see as propaganda. I can't think of another word that would more accurately describe the 1619 project.
Good. Well, thanks very much, Mary. Let me ask you this question. What's been the response to your book? In particular, perhaps I'd like to know if any of the people who you've called out for their falsehoods and misinformation, have they chosen to seriously engage, or are you just getting demonized by those folks?
Yeah, well, that's a great question, because as we were talking before, I'm on Twitter, and so I was following Nicole Hannah-Jones, and she hasn't really written much, but she's on Twitter quite a bit. I mean, dozens of times a day, and so that's where people get news about her. And somehow she got wind of the fact that I was following her. Someone tagged us, and so I brought up a fact, something like, the fact that, slaves weren't kidnapped by Europeans from Africa. And, she accused me of racism. She insulted what she called my little pamphlet. She does this routinely to anyone who critiques her. Phil Magnus, who was one of the economic historians that I cite in my last chapter, she goes after him all the time. So there is no engagement. And I think, as a matter of fact, she sent her followers to my Amazon page, who obviously have not even read beyond the title of my book and have just, posted insulting comments. So there is no engagement on the left. There is just insult and accusations of racism. And it's not just me, Gordon Wood, I mean, but, she actually thinks that she knows more about history than Gordon Wood does. So that tells you something.
Yeah. Yeah, it sure does. Let me ask one more question, then we'll start on questions from the viewers. What about higher education? We know that there's been a big attempt to smuggle this disinformation into public schools. What about higher education? Are professors having students read this stuff, and is this material seeping into lectures and discussions?
Yeah, well, here, Hamilton College during the summer of 2020, during the 1619 project riots, as you may recall, and every college president was, fighting racism. I mean, it was recommended to all students to read. There have been reading groups on campus. It's being taught in English classes. There's a professor at Notre Dame, and someone who taught English. I mean, that's what's striking to me about it, is this breakdown between fiction and nonfiction. So, is this history? Well, are you going to then teach it as history? But you've got this mishmash of literary works, these highly emotional essays that are, weaving in personal experiences, leaving huge gaps in history. So I wrote an article about that, and one of the kids, or one of the students in this Notre Dame class, said that he'd already had the 1619 project in high school. So he was getting it again in an English class in college. Now, it's been out there for 2 years. So conceivably, people who have had it in grammar school or elementary school and in high school could then be subjected to it again in college. And I was amazed by the number of history professors who came to the defense of the 1619 project. One of her main defenders is Woody Holton, who I dub as sort of being Howard Zinn light, L-I-T-E, in his writing, is a champion of her. He's trying to ride her coattails, and, because he writes these supposedly bottom-up histories, and now he wants to become as famous as she is. And I've written a couple articles for American Greatness that sort of traces the trajectory of these historians. So they come to her defense. Sometimes they reverse themselves and will defend her because, if there's any perception that a conservative has a criticism of this, then they will go against what they've said before and attack conservatives or moderates or traditional liberals and come to the defense of what they know is a bogus sort of a historical account of this country.
Yes. Well, let's turn to questions from some of the viewers. We have one from David, who asks, is there any hope of turning back the slavish enthusiasm to the 1619 project among American elites and opinion molders, so long as progressives enjoy overwhelming dominance over the mainstream media, the academy, and powerful, well-funded foundations? What do you think, Mary?
Well, yeah, it has to be at the political level. And, I saw this, I've been writing about higher education and then K through 12 education as well for years now when I was still teaching. And I saw this crazy stuff. The general public sees critical race theory as, something outlandish and absurd. But I was reading this stuff in graduate school in the 1990s and shaking my head and trying to tell people. And a lot of times they didn't believe me. They dismiss it as, oh, well, that's the crazy wackos in the English department. You're reading all this theory, this postmodern theory. And I would be talking to Tea Party groups, and I'd say, look, you've got to call your legislators, you've got to go to these meetings, you've got to show up in force and fight this stuff. I'm telling you what I'm seeing. Finally, people are waking up and they're going to the school board meetings, they're running for school boards. I just spoke to a couple Moms for Liberty groups. There are people that never before would have run for the school board, but school board races are hot right now, and I think that's where it's going to have to be. And I've been a proponent of the people taking back the power, especially at the K through 12 level, and especially at state-funded schools. And I've always said, teachers, a lot of these, the vast majority of teachers who, are on the left, think that they don't have a job description. Well, they do have a job description. They can't, talk about anything they want to talk about, their pet social justice project. They're being paid by parents, by citizens, and we need to take the power back. And we need to have these laws, especially transparency laws. And we can't let our guard down. I have an article coming out soon about a conference that I attended online, put on by the Pulitzer Center, and they're giving tips to teachers on how to subvert these laws, how to slip in the 1619 project. So, people cannot let their guards down because they're constantly working behind the scenes. They've got the money. That's true. They've got billionaires funding them. And I would also advocate looking at the laws for nonprofits. Should you be, is this legitimate work? It's not educational. There is no vetting. There's no even-handed discussion. How can we indirectly, at least, be paying, taxpayers be paying for the promotion of this material that is making a number of people very rich when it hasn't gone through any kind of a process that other materials go through?
Good point. Oh, here's another question. Mary asks, how can parents and teachers of K-12 students monitor CRT material in the classroom in schools where CRT is slid in by administrators who are dishonest about the content?
Yeah, well, talk to your kids. I'm all for these transparency laws. It's even been proposed to allow parents to sit in on classes and to have recordings. A lot of educators are opposed to that. And, so you wonder why. I mean, when I taught, I'd have, friends of students come in, sit in on my class, to see if they wanted to sign up for it. I'd have parents coming in. I had students recording my lectures. I had no problem with it. And if you're a good teacher or professor, you should have no problem with that at all. And so, I would keep fighting for the transparency. And it's a little harder now because so many things are online. So, I would go in and I would say, hey, we're going to have a group of parents. We insist on sitting in on this class. We're going to take turns.
Yes.
All right.
I think that's a terrific idea. I'd love to see that start happening.
Well, yeah, give me credit.
Okay, Mary. Well, I don't see any other questions from our viewers. So maybe at this point, we'll just say thanks very much, and we hope you will keep on writing about this. And again, I'll extol your blog, Dissident Prof. People should go to it. Sign up for it.
Yeah, and I would like to add, if you go to my website, if you go to Dissident Prof, or if you go to marygrabar.com, Regnery is running a special. So you can get $10 off of Debunking the 1619 Project. And so I encourage people to use it, and I hope it will give you the ammunition for when you go before the school board, or you talk about what's being taught with your child's teacher, that it will give you the information that you need to refute the 1619 Project. Because I think the reason the 1619 Project has taken off is because the argument is made on an emotional level. People glom on to this idea, that all Black people were oppressed. And I'm not denying that, that there was segregation and slavery and so forth, and, unfairness. But it's not the way the 1619 Project presents it. It's very harmful. It's harmful psychologically to kids of all races. And I think the way to fight this emotional push is with facts. Just keep sticking to the facts. And so I hope my book will help in that way.
Yes. Well, we have a few more questions now.
Okay.
Rebecca would like to know, I have a question. Any advice for those of us who are being marginalized on our campuses for resisting the current liberalism? Or I think she wrote illiberalism, which is actually true. It's not the opposite of liberalism. We're seeing illiberalism all over our campuses.
Yeah, well, as someone who, taught as an adjunct and was canceled a couple times from classes, if you're teaching at the K through, I don't know if she's teaching this for K through 12, I would try to get allies among parents. Mm-hmm. Keep records, document everything. It really is hard. I mean, you are so outnumbered, whether it's K through 12 or on a college campus. And I would just try to get allies. I think one of the positive things that has emerged is that even people who don't identify as conservative have become alarmed. You've got Barry Weiss, and I can't remember their names, but people whose kids were in private schools and they're subjected to, what are indoctrinations sessions in school. So try to form these little groups, where you get allies. And as you're the attorney, you can keep records, right, George?
That's a good point. Keep good documents on everything. Yeah. Susan wants to know if we'll be able to view this later, and the answer is yes. We are recording it and will be available on our site. And Kathy says, thank you for answering my question before, namely about where are your books available, and which other than Amazon, because she would like to avoid Amazon.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so go to my website, and you'll see the link, and that will take you, it has a little code, and you get $10 off. It'll take you to the Regnery website, which is the publisher. So they have a special going. One of the things that Nicole Hannah-Jones, the creator of This Big Mess, has done, and she is very expert at this, on Twitter, they have this project going where people have, even before the book came out, months before the book came out, they would buy up copies to donate to schools and to libraries. And so, I'm hoping that for the poor kids who have to read the 1619 Project, that they may have access to my book. And there are some other good books out there that refute the 1619 Project, because I know from talking to students, they're just given one line. They don't, it strikes them as being wrong, but they just don't know where to go. So, if you have, $20 extra or $40, and you can send it to your library or your school library, I'd appreciate that too.
Okay. Well, here's a question from Roy, who wants to know, is there an error in the 1619 Project you would consider the most egregious?
I would say the claim that this country was founded as a slaveocracy.
Mm-hmm.
There are other forms of government that are still slaveocracies, and there have been throughout history. But most educated people know, and especially those who sort of have a perspective on world history, that this is the freest, has been the freest country in the world. My parents and my relatives came here for freedom and opportunity. And, I think the people who are writing the 1619 Project, they need to get out a little bit more, talk to these people who are from communist countries. And so I think that is like the biggest slander, that, slavery was a fact of life at the time, but it was a fact of life in the world. And we led the way in abolishing the practice of slavery. So it contradicts the reality.
We have a follow-up here from Mary, who says she was a teacher and has experienced bullying. And when that happened, the principal simply blew off her concerns. So how do you guard against being bullied by pro-CRT colleagues?
Yeah, it's really tough. I mean, you've got the administration that's against you, and I don't. Again, I would try to develop allies in the community. And this is why, I've been a proponent of, sort of the citizens taking back the schools from these people who claim to be experts and who are really just ideologues and political activists, and are often very screwed up, are very disturbed people. But, just, it's hard because, and I know what it's like. You're walking on eggshells. You think you can be fired at any moment. You get hostile stares. People don't talk to you. You're called racist or bigot or whatever, and it's a hostile work environment. So, but work on the side to get the laws changed.
Good advice. Well, I think that's the end of our questions. Wait a minute. We have another one. David again asks, just my glasses here. The mostly Republican Board of Trustees of the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, voted in 2021 to give Nicole Hannah-Jones tenure in the UNC Hussman School of Journalism and Media, which she declined. What should citizens do if governing educational boards, even dominated by Republicans, continue to roll over in the face of strident advocacy for far leftist teaching and progressive professors? How about that?
Yeah, well, they capitulated. I think that was after a pressure campaign,
Right.
right? By the NAACP was threatening to sue, and there were protests on campus. And and then Nicole Hannah-Jones just flippantly the next morning made an announcement on CBS that she's going to Howard University. I don't know how the system works in North Carolina, but I lived in Georgia for a long time, and the Board of Regents, I think, was appointed by the governor. So again, these people who make these academic decisions need to have some power taken away from them. They like to pretend that they have all the answers and they have the degrees, and you little people don't know anything. But we need to start changing that politically.
Couldn't agree more. Well, I see no more questions. So Mary, thanks very much for a very good afternoon.
Oh, thank you. It's my pleasure.
Wait a minute. Mary
Yeah.
would like to know, how does one find a lawyer to represent a teacher who is being bullied? Any ideas on that?
Oh, well, I was almost represented, I think it was by the Alliance Defending Freedom.
Yes, ADF, good organization.
Yeah, and I think they would have taken my case, except that, because I was an adjunct, I was from semester to semester. So I would ask them, and good, sue the hell out of them.
Sue, yes. Again, it's Alliance Defending Freedom, a very good organization that's fought many of these kinds of battles. So check out Alliance Defending Freedom. All right, well, I think now we've reached the end of our questions. So thanks very much, Mary. It's been a great afternoon.
Yeah, it has been fun. Thank you.